I never thought much about family traditions, to be honest. Growing up, they always seemed like mere obligations, something to endure rather than cherish. The annual Thanksgiving gathering was my least favorite. My extended family was massive, and every year, I, a socially anxious introvert, was thrust into a teeming room of relatives with whom I had little in common. The endless noise of laughter and chatter felt suffocating. By the time the day was over, I would be an exhausted shell of myself, grateful for Monday to arrive so I could return to the comforting isolation of my room. But what happened last Thanksgiving changed everything. It started like any other year. The leaves had all turned shades of amber and red, the air was crisp, and my mother buzzed around the kitchen, crafting her secret stuffing recipe, while I feigned interest in a football game that I genuinely could not care less about. I had promised myself that this would be a day like any other, merely a time to sip cider and smile through the small talk. But when the guests began to arrive, I noticed something was off, an unnatural tension hung in the air. It wasn't right. Glances were exchanged, hushed whispers followed by laughter that didn't quite reach anyone's eyes. My grandmother, usually the centerpiece of our gatherings, was unusually quiet, her gaze fixed on her hands as she kneaded dough for her infamous pumpkin pie. Soon enough, the doorbell rang again, and in walked Aunt Carol, her face pallid and drawn. She stood in the entryway for a moment, eyes darting around the room, searching for what, I didn't know. Then she spotted Grandma. "Mom, can we talk? It's about Dad." That was all it took to deflate the room. The laughter died down as the conversation shifted to a more somber tone. I caught snippets of their discussion, the end being mentioned repeatedly, words like hospital and treatment floated through the room, and my heart sank deeper with every syllable. My grandfather, the man I had never seen weak, was evidently fading. My inner turmoil twisted. I had never formed a deep bond with him. I often regretted not getting to know him better, but amongst the chaos of family traditions, he remained a distant figure. I was about to slip away into the recesses of the house when my grandmother's voice broke through the air. "We can't let him go not knowing how much he means to us," she said, her voice trembling and strong. Suddenly, she stood tall, the matriarch of our family, and a plan took form. I watched as the relatives clustered together, whispering intensely, their frowns transformed into determined expressions. I began to listen to their whispers. Apparently, Grandma had decided that we needed to rally around my grandfather, to share with him stories of our best memories, of laughter, family silliness, and love. With shaky breaths and hesitant nods, we agreed. It was time to stop thinking of traditions as mere obligations. We were going to create new memories, ones steeped in love and honor, and as a family, we would do it together. Reluctantly, I found a seat in the middle of the circle they formed in the living room. Each family member took turns, sharing warm anecdotes about Grandpa, how he could fall asleep at the dinner table and snort loudly, how he would scare away kids from the neighborhood during Halloween because of his over-the-top costumes, the joy in his eyes at Sunday get-togethers by the golf course. Stories tumbled out like a waterfall, cleansing the somberness of the day and bringing forth joyous laughter. Yet, with every nostalgic tale, I felt an increasing heaviness in my chest, a need to contribute, to be a part of this moment we were creating together. But what could I say when I had spent so many years on the fringes? And then, something shifted in me. I thought of the many car rides to my grandfather's house, my childhood wonder at his lawn filled with flamingos, and each calm evening spent listening to him recount stories from his youth. Slowly, almost as if guided by some unseen force, I found my voice. I shared the time he took me fishing, his patience endless even as I exclaimed, "I caught a fish," when it turned out to be a shoe. The laughter that erupted felt electric, and as I spoke, I saw my grandfather's eyes flicker to life as if awakening from a long slumber. After I shared, I could tell it resonated. My cousin chimed in next, and soon the room erupted into a veritable cacophony of love. The warmth enveloped us, and time seemed to dissipate. Hours passed in beautifully chaotic harmony, stories spilling forth like a torrent. We shared our vulnerabilities, our hopes, and cherished memories each of us had about Grandpa that we had failed to voice for so long. In those moments, I realized that this spontaneous gathering, born of a painful necessity, was its own tradition, born from love and respect and the unyielding bond of family. As the evening drew to a close, my grandfather, who had barely been speaking, suddenly cleared his throat. He looked around at all of us, lined up like dominoes, and smiled, one of those deep, heart-touching smiles. "I never realized how much I meant to all of you. Thank you for reminding me tonight. You are my greatest legacy. As he spoke those words, a thick presence hovered in the air, a profound sense of understanding dawning upon me. I had spent my life running from familial interactions, but in that moment, I found a home within them. Family was never a burden, it was a safety net, a reminder of who we are when we're lost. It was the stories we tell, the laughter we share, and sometimes the tears we cry together. In the days that followed, my grandfather's health began to stabilize, and it felt as though we had unwittingly breathed life back into him through our stories. I learned that family traditions might evolve, but the core of what they represent, the connection between souls, the sharing of memories, and the act of loving each other, remained timeless. I left that Thanksgiving with a gratitude I had never before experienced. Everyone could witness the renewed bond we had cultivated, but what truly mattered was how I had finally learned to cherish those moments and embrace my family. This experience, born of uncertainty and purpose, reshaped who I was and how I viewed family traditions. They were no longer obligations. They were the threads that held the fabric of our lives together, unique and intricate, always weaving love into our shared narratives. So now, every Thanksgiving following that day, we gather, not just to feast on turkey and pie, but to share stories. And I never miss a chance to add mine.
When my 15-year-old daughter Mia, who has always struggled with socially awkward moments and anxiety, suddenly declared to her friends that she was autistic, the room held its breath, as if even the air couldn't quite figure out how to respond. I could see the confusion in their eyes, they glanced at one another like kids at a secretive game. My heart sank, a visceral ache, because Mia had never received a formal diagnosis, not even from the therapist I'd taken her to after countless nights of her tossing and turning, fighting the shadows of her own fears. The relief I found when we were told she might not be on the spectrum, just a sensitive girl struggling with her place in a world that felt too loud and crowded for her, had faded when I heard her embrace this label with her friends as if it were a shield. I snapped. I couldn't stand by and watch her distort the truth to fit some twisted narrative of belonging. Mia, you're not autistic. You're just different, but not in that way, I said, my voice cutting through the hesitant silence like a knife. Instantly, her friends shifted in their seats, and Mia's face crumpled into something I thought only existed in exaggerated depictions of heartbreak. Her friends stared wide-eyed, suddenly feeling like they were intruding on something vastly inappropriate. Guilt crept in like a phantom, gnawing at my stomach as Mia shot me the kind of look that froze my blood. I had no intention of rendering her vulnerable or exposed, but she had gripped that label like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. The fallout escalated swiftly. Whispers chased Mia every step of the way at school while I busied myself pretending nothing was wrong, a tactic masking my own spiraling guilt. Days blurred into weeks, and I found myself inspecting her artwork, shifting around her diary whenever the opportunity presented itself, praying for a glimpse into her turmoil. I was lost, buried under guilt and fear, thinking back to how I saw my own mother react to me whenever I mentioned my struggles, always questioning if my emotional responses were merely a dramatic flare. Eventually, Mia stumbled into my room one night, her eyes red-rimmed and glistening with a treacherous brew of hurt and disappointment. "Why don't you want to believe me?" she whispered. It was quiet, a soft incantation that begged for answers. I was trapped in the fragile kaleidoscope of parenthood, every turn revealing more intricate patterns of love, fear, and overwhelming empathy. I wanted to tell her it was because the world can be cruel and harsh, that labels entrap people, but how could I craft understanding through a lens of misunderstanding? As the moonlight crept through the window, painting her face in a silver glow, I saw not the labels or the public perception but her, my precious daughter, raw and beautiful and passionate. I wanted to hug her tightly, shield her from the looming shadows that whispered malice, yet I wordlessly watched as she pulled away, inhabiting a painful silence I hadn't known I had created. I began to pay closer attention at school, the way classmates would snicker behind her back, calling her drama queen. I wanted to intervene, stamp out the ridicule engulfing the pure heart of the girl I adored. One week, I timidly approached her art teacher, a soft-spoken woman who had an undeniable warmth, and delicately voiced my concerns. But to my devastation, she smiled gently and said, "Mia's uniqueness is precisely what makes her special. Sometimes, labels help kids understand their differences, but we must let them create their own identity." The sincerity in her tone gnawed at the guilt festering inside me, and paranoia wrapped me tighter than before, but nothing prepared me for what would happen next. I decided to dig deeper. One desperate night, I stayed up, scrolling through forums and posts late into the dark hours, looking for answers, signs, or something. That's when I stumbled upon a thread titled The Shadows of the Mind, where each user shared their struggles, and there were stories mimicking what I feared: friends who claimed to understand autism without experiencing it themselves, children gravitating toward constructs that isolated them further from family and reality. Somewhere along the lines, someone wrote, "Be careful what you identify yourself with, the shadows may just snatch you away." I felt that phrase gnaw at my consciousness, shattering my heart again. I confronted my daughter, this time softer, asking her to unravel the moments leading to her identity choice, to bear the truth like a tapestry unfurling on the floor. When she finally spoke, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, she voiced the loneliness that consumed her as she drifted between worlds, school hierarchies that felt impenetrable, a deep-seated need for connection pulling her towards something relatable, something she could share over late-night phone calls. In one agonizing moment, it all unraveled. I realized I hadn't been the anchor she needed. Instead, I had thrown her ship into rough seas. My desperation for clarity had strapped her to rocks when I should have been lifting her higher. It was after this that I vowed to change. I had to embrace her whole self, the good, the bad, the peculiar. Now, we navigate this labyrinth together, me learning to understand her world rather than demanding she navigate through mine. No more labels, no more betrayal of her spirit. Just a father and his daughter, redefining what unconditional love means amidst the chaos, as I silently tread the waters of anxiety that emptied into the shadows of the forgotten, hoping her essence remains intact and untouched.
When I made a promise to myself, a new beginning, it felt like the weight of the world lifted off my shoulders. I found myself in a dimly lit room, the smell of stale coffee wafting through the air, curling around the worn-out chairs scattered haphazardly around the tables. It was a local support group, a pit stop for lost souls. I sat in the corner, nursing a cup that was more cold than brewed, choosing to keep my distance from the others. We all shared a similar burden, broken dreams and lost hopes. I wasn't there just to listen, I was searching for something I had lost. A sense of myself. My name is Clara, and before that night, I was someone who constantly reassured herself that everything was fine, that I could handle my life, until I couldn't. It was a cascade of failures that pushed me into that room, each disappointment adding another stone to my already heavy backpack of regret. My job had become unbearably stifling, my relationships felt hollow, and even the joy I used to find in simple pleasures had faded away, snuffed out like a candle in the wind. On that particular evening, however, something shifted in me. The group leader, a woman named Marissa, stood up to speak about resilience and renewal, her words flowing like a balm over our terrified hearts. I closed my eyes, reflecting on my own life, and that's when I made my promise, to reclaim the power I had relinquished, to start anew, not for anyone else, but for myself. I left the room feeling oddly empowered, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. I had no real plan, just the bare bones of a determination I hadn't felt in years. That night, I threw out the old clothes that made me feel like a ghost of my former self. I deleted all the pictures on my phone that reminded me of times I felt trapped. I even got rid of the old furniture in my apartment that carried whispers of bitter memories. By the dawn of the new day, my surroundings mirrored my inner turmoil. Everything felt like a new canvas waiting to be painted, but the color was yet to be chosen. I replaced the grays and browns with splashes of vibrant yellows and blues. It felt liberating, exhilarating, like breaking free from a cage I didn't realize I had been living in for so long. But as my promise deepened, I began to feel something else creeping in, an undeniable sensation that perhaps I had just disturbed something deep within myself. I started running in the mornings, immersing myself in nature, trying to rediscover what made Clara, Clara. My feet would pound against the pavement, echoing against the silence, and I started to think that life was about moving forward, putting distance between myself and the shadows I had left behind. I met new people, joined clubs, and even went on a few dates. I felt like I was living my life vividly, for the first time in ages. But then, something began to happen that I couldn't make sense of. Late at night, as I drifted off to sleep, I started having dreams. At first, they seemed innocuous, images of me in the forest running freely, laughing with children that didn't exist. But then the dreams changed. In them, I would be running, but not towards something peaceful. The trees would morph into skeletal hands reaching for me, the laughter of children turning to sinister whispers that echoed in the dark corners of my mind. Panic flooded my waking moments as I tried to piece together if my past was truly behind me, or if it lurked just outside the periphery of my new life, waiting for me to stumble. I confided in Marissa during one of our sessions, trying to weigh my fears against the promise I had made. She listened intently, her eyes flickering with understanding. "It's like a shadow, Clara," she said. "You can step away from it, but the shadow will always try to follow you. You need to confront what you're running from, not just run in the opposite direction." I pondered her words for days, the dreams haunting me with unshakable consistency. I finally decided that if I was truly going to start fresh, I had to face what dwelled in those dark recesses of my mind. So I made a plan. I returned to my childhood home, a place that held both sweetness and bitterness. Standing in front of the worn door, I felt an uncanny mix of nostalgia and dread. It was an empty shell now, a repository of memories I had left behind. I told myself I would sift through all the clutter, confront the skeletons in the closets, and in doing so break the spell that shadowed my new beginning. Inside, dust motes danced under shafts of sunlight, but the air was thick and stale, heavy with secrets I had buried. I found boxes upon boxes of memories, old photos, broken trinkets, and letters that provided insight into who I used to be. As I rummaged through them, pieces of joy intermingled with pain, anger with love. I held on to each item, recalling the moments tied to them, trying to heal, to understand. But somewhere amid the clutter, I stumbled upon a journal I had kept as a teenager. The pages were filled with raw emotions, unfiltered hopes, and heartaches that had felt monumental at the time. I flipped through the pages, my pulse quickening, until I reached a passage that sent chills down my spine. "Sometimes, I feel an emptiness that screams louder than the world around me. I promise that I won't let it drown me." I realized with a sickening lurch that I had made that promise long ago, and yet somehow had forgotten what it truly meant. In my desperate attempt to start anew, I had run away from not only my pain but also my resilience. Inspiration hit me like a crack of lightning. My promise needed to evolve. It was no longer just about removing shadows but embracing every facet of who I had been and who I wanted to become. Exhausted but filled with renewed clarity, I left the house, cradling the journal to my chest. I returned to the support group, ready to truly share, to reveal not just the surface-level struggles, but the deep-rooted battles that had forged me. As I spoke, I felt a catharsis, a release, and for the first time, I could see the threads of connection that bind us all. They listened with empathy, their eyes reflecting shared pain and understanding, and in that moment, I realized my new beginning wasn't merely a promise to rise but to acknowledge where I had come from. I learned that running from my past had only chained me to it, and facing it transformed my darkness into light. I left that meeting with a heart full of understanding and new wisdom. The beginning is not the absence of struggle but the acceptance of every moment, every scar, and the courage to embrace life entirely, as messy and beautiful as it is. How I faced my fears during a scary trip. How I faced my fears during a scary trip. I had always been the kind of person who avoided anything remotely terrifying. Heights? Nope. Spiders? Hard pass. And don't even get me started on the dark. I'm still the person who sleeps with a nightlight. So when my friends proposed a camping trip to a supposedly haunted forest that lay deep in the heart of the mountains, my immediate reaction was to back out. But after some serious peer pressure and a little too much pride to admit I was afraid, I reluctantly agreed. I told myself it was just one night, and I could handle one night. Little did I know, that one night would completely change my perception of fear and, in many ways, myself. The drive up to the forest was an experience in itself. As we wound our way up the narrow mountain road, thick trees loomed over us on both sides, creating a canopy so dense it almost felt like nightfall despite it being the day. The sky grew cloudy, and soon rain started to pour, drumming on the car roof as if warning us to turn back. We finally reached the entrance to the trail, and as soon as I stepped out of the car, a chill ran through me. I brushed it off, though, blaming it on the cold rain and the lack of sleep from the restless night before. My friends, meanwhile, seemed totally unfazed as they laughed and joked, their voices echoing in the quiet, eerie forest. Armed with backpacks and flashlights, we started the hike to our campsite, a spot nestled near the edge of a small lake a few miles into the woods. As we walked, the forest seemed to close in around us, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves causing my heart to pound a little faster. My friends were too busy talking to notice the sounds, but I felt like we were being watched. Maybe it was just my paranoia kicking in, or maybe something really was out there. When we finally reached the campsite, the rain had stopped, and fog began rolling over the lake, adding an even spookier vibe. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and, as darkness fell, settled around the campfire with mugs of hot chocolate. That's when one of my friends, Kyle, suggested we tell scary stories. I inwardly groaned, knowing this would only make my already fragile nerves worse, but everyone seemed into it, so I went along with it. Kyle kicked things off with a creepy local legend about the forest, a story I wish I had never heard. According to him, years ago, a group of people disappeared in these woods under strange circumstances. They were supposedly part of some cult, performing strange rituals near the lake before they vanished without a trace. Some believe their spirits still wander, looking for new souls to join them. My friends laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the image of shadowy figures lurking in the fog, watching us. By the time we'd all told a story, the fire was dying down, and exhaustion began to creep in. We decided to turn in, each of us retreating to our own tent. As I lay there, trying to ignore the sounds outside, the faint crackle of leaves, the occasional drip of water from the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. My rational side told me it was just the forest settling, animals scurrying around, but my imagination conjured up images of ghostly figures, just like in Kyle's story, standing outside my tent. I lay there in silence, every nerve on edge, until I finally drifted into a restless sleep. But then, in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a sound. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then I heard it again, a low, guttural whisper, just outside my tent. My heart nearly stopped. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear more, when suddenly, a shadow passed across my tent, barely illuminated by the faint moonlight. I wanted to call out to my friends, but fear clamped my throat shut. I was terrified, more terrified than I'd ever been in my life. All my instincts screamed at me to stay still, to wait it out, but something inside me snapped. I couldn't let fear control me any longer, not here, not now. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I scanned the area, my flashlight casting beams through the thick fog. My friends' tents were silent and still. I was about to call out when I heard it again, that same whisper, low and garbled, seeming to come from the edge of the lake. Against my better judgment, I started walking toward it, each step feeling heavier, like I was wading through water. As I got closer to the lake, the fog thickened, making it hard to see. The whispers grew louder, and now they seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding me. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw something, a figure standing on the edge of the lake, barely visible through the fog. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure turned, and I saw a face, but it wasn't quite right. The features were blurred, almost shifting, like I was looking at it through rippling water. Then it spoke, or maybe it was just another whisper, but I heard it as clear as day. "Why did you come here?" My heart hammered, and I felt a wave of fear so intense I thought I'd collapse. But something kept me rooted to the spot. "Who are you?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The figure tilted its head, studying me with eyes that seemed too dark, too empty. "We are the ones who stayed," it said, its voice an echo that seemed to come from within my own mind. I don't know what possessed me to keep talking, maybe desperation or the need to know, but I asked, "What do you want?" The figure's face twisted into something like a smile, though it was more disturbing than comforting. "Company," it whispered. "We're so lonely." Suddenly, there was a movement from behind me, and I spun around, only to see my friends standing there, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. Apparently, they had heard the whispers too and had woken up too. "Find me gone." They had followed the sound of my footsteps and were as terrified as I was. In that moment, the spell seemed to break. We turned and ran back to the campsite, not stopping until we were huddled around the dying embers of the fire, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. No one said a word, but we all understood. We had seen something that defied explanation, something we couldn't rationalize or laugh off. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up in silence and hiked back to the car, each of us lost in our own thoughts. That drive home was the quietest I'd ever experienced, the memory of that night etched into my mind, too vivid to ignore. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I doubt I ever will. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear those whispers, faint and distant, calling me back to that lake, back to the fog, back to the ones who stayed. I still remember the day it all happened, the day that shattered how I thought about my child, how I viewed the world, and ultimately, my perception of reality itself. My daughter, Ava, was 7 at the time, and like any parent, I couldn't help but marvel at the small wonders she'd display each day. Since she was born, I'd seen her giggle at nothing, speak to imaginary friends, and draw pictures that made no sense to me. But on that fateful day, she did something that defied every rational explanation I had learned in my 35 years of life. It began as a typical Saturday morning, with Ava racing around the living room, a whirlwind of energy and excitement. I was barely awake, nursing my second cup of coffee while she played with her dolls. It was a bright and sunny day, and I remember telling her we could go to the park later, which made her squeal with delight and bounce on her toes. But the light-hearted atmosphere quickly took a sharp turn when she suddenly stopped playing, her eyes fixated on something outside the large bay window that overlooked our backyard. I followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual, the usual birds and squirrels darting about. I glanced back at her, but it was as if her eyes weren't merely looking at something, they were penetrating a barrier between our world and another. "Ava, what do you see?" I asked, half-jokingly, hoping to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. She didn't respond. Instead, she stood stock-still, her little fingers gripping the edge of the windowsill. A soft murmur began to tumble from her lips, too quiet for me to pick up the words. It sounded like a lullaby, something soothing, but unnerving in the way it resonated against the silence of the house. Concern crept into my heart. "Ava, honey, please. Are you okay?" I moved closer, my curiosity piqued but my instincts telling me that something was off. The air felt charged, heavy, as if the world was holding its breath. Then, without warning, she turned her head toward me, and I swear her eyes were a different color, something darker, deeper, almost fathomless. "It's coming," she whispered. I felt a chill run down my spine. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang, shattering the moment. I jumped, and Ava snapped back to reality, her bright blue eyes sparkling once more. "Can I get it, Dad?" she asked, bouncing toward the door before I had the chance to answer. I hesitated, a mixture of relief and confusion swirling in my gut. I wanted to shield her, but she was already reaching for the door handle. I hurried after her, uncertainty gnawing at me. When I opened the door, there stood a man in a dark coat, his expression unreadable. "Hello, is Ava here?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. There was something odd about him, something unsettling. I felt a pang of protective instinct kick in, and I glanced back at Ava, who was standing too close to the stranger, her curiosity evident in her wide eyes. "Who are you, and how do you know my daughter?" I demanded, my voice sharp. The man's lips curved into a faint smile. "I know many things. Ava is special, isn't she?" His gaze shifted from me to her, and the way he looked at her made my skin crawl. "She has a gift." I took a step forward, a protective barrier between my daughter and this man. "You need to leave." But before I could close the door, he reached out, gently brushing his fingers against Ava's forehead. "Don't be afraid, Ava. They're only waiting." I yanked her back, dragging her away from him. "Get away from her." The man merely chuckled softly, as if amused by my outburst. "You should let her understand, Father." The moment she saw it was just the beginning. With that, he turned and walked away, vanishing down the street as if swallowed by shadows. Ava's laughter rang after him, a sound too joyous for the moment. "Did you see him, Dad?" "He knows." Panic twisted in my gut. "Ava, who was that?" "What do you mean he knows?" She looked at me, her expression suddenly serious, the laughter fading. "The things I see, Dad. The things I can do. They wait for me." Confusion clouded my thoughts. "Sweetheart, let's just..." "No, you don't understand." She interrupted, her voice rising. "I can show you. I need to show you." It was a plea, a desperation I had never seen in her before. Still, I felt an instinctual drive to protect her, to shield her from whatever darkness lingered beyond her childish imagination. "Ava, please, just come with me." I took her hand and led her back inside, where it felt safe and familiar, but I could still feel that eerie shiver crawling up my spine. As the hours passed, I tried to distract her, pull her back to the comfort of coloring books and cartoons, but her eyes were distant, already lost to the other world. Then night fell. I thought if I tucked her into bed, told her a story, maybe I could erase the haunting encounter. I climbed into her bed and began to talk about the adventures of brave knights and sleeping dragons, my voice calming as I hoped to banish her fears. But halfway through the story, I paused when I noticed she was no longer listening. Her gaze was fixed on the corner of the room, her body tense. "Ava?" I called softly. Silence. I turned to follow her stare and felt my blood run cold. In the corner, where the shadows pooled deepest, a figure stood, tall and black against the dim glow of her nightlight, an amorphous shape that seemed to pulse and breathe. It wasn't the man from earlier, this presence felt wrong in a way I can't explain, as if it was utterly alien, entirely separate from our realm. Fear gripped my heart relentlessly. "Ava, baby, it's okay. I'm right here." She didn't move. "They came for me, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They want me to go with them." There it was again, the dread of knowing this wasn't merely a figment of her imagination. I leapt from the bed, my instincts screaming at me to protect her. "No. You're not going anywhere," I shouted. My voice shattered the silence, and the figure recoiled, melting into the shadows before swiftly disappearing. Ava let out a small whimper, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Dad, I don't want to lose you." I climbed back into the bed, pulling her against me, heart pounding like a war drum. "You're not losing me, Ava. I promise." But deep down, an unsettling truth gnawed at me, I might not have the power to keep her safe. We lay there, entwined, until sleep finally claimed me, but it was a restless slumber, filled with twisted dreams of darkness chasing after us. The next morning, I woke to an empty house. The sun filtered through the curtains, and for a split second, I felt relief wash over me. But then I remembered. I scrambled out of bed, calling Ava's name, panic coursing through my veins. She wasn't in the living room, the kitchen, or even outside in the yard. She was gone. I searched every inch of the house before finally noticing her bedroom door cracked open. I burst in, and my heart stopped. In the middle of the floor, surrounded by her toys, was Ava, her eyes closed and her lips moving as if she were chanting. A circle made of small rocks surrounded her, each one gleaming with a faint, unnatural light. I couldn't fathom what I was seeing. "Ava," I cried, rushing toward her. When I reached her, it felt like walking into a wall of cold air. She felt different, she looked different. Her tiny frame seemed almost alive with a strange energy. "Ava," I yelled, shaking her shoulders. She didn't respond. Instead, her eyes snapped open, now a swirling kaleidoscope of colors, deeper than the ocean, brighter than the sun. "You need to let me go," she said, her voice unfamiliar, warped. "They're calling for me." Panic gripped me a second time. "No, no, no. I won't let you." I wrapped my arms around her, crying, begging the universe to spare my child. The rocks pulsed, and a deafening sound echoed through the room. It was like 1,000 whispers weaving through the air, drowning out everything else. I could feel the walls vibrating around us, the very foundations of our home trembling. The air thickened, charged with a dark energy that pressed against me, urging me to let go. "Ava, please!" I screamed. And then, in an instant, everything stopped. She collapsed, and I cradled her in my arms, her eyes returning to their sky-blue innocence. She looked up at me, bewildered. "Daddy! What happened?" I felt tears streaming down my cheeks. You were gone." I hugged her tightly, but a voice echoed in my mind, clear and cold. "She is ours." In that moment, I understood the truth, that essence of childhood wonder can hold darkness unimaginable. I never spoke of that day again, I buried it deep, stuffed it into a forgotten corner of my mind. But as time wore on, I noticed other peculiarities. Things went missing, little trinkets I was sure she had touched. Once, while cleaning, I discovered a drawing she had completed, depicting our family surrounded by shadows. In the corner, there was a tall figure, with dark eyes and a sinister grin. Ava never talked about the incident again, but sometimes, at night, I'd hear her mumbling to herself, and if I listened closely, I could swear I heard her whispering names, strange, otherworldly names that sent chills down my spine. But what truly terrified me was the way she would sometimes glance outside as if waiting, as if she knew they were still there, watching. Waiting. I'm writing this now, nearly a year later, trying to make sense of everything, unable to shake the feeling that I'm running against time. Because lately, Ava has been talking about things I can't comprehend, that she's ready to go join them, that they've given her the chance. I don't know what they want from her, and I don't know how to save her. But if you're reading this, take it from me, believe your child when they tell you they see something. Protect them fiercely, for there are things out there that steer the innocent toward darkness in a gentle whisper, and sometimes those things are far too close to home. I can only pray, I can hold on to hope. And if you hear that lullaby, if you see them waiting, for the love of everything, run.
I had never been one to shy away from a bit of fun, especially when Halloween rolled around, and this year was no different. I splurged on a scandalous pepper costume, complete with leaves, shiny red fabric, and strategically placed cutouts that left just enough to the imagination but still screamed "look at me." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow that wrapped the world in shadows, I felt a thrill run through me at the thought of the parties bursting with laughter and shenanigans. I decided to host my own get-together, inviting friends and neighbors alike, and as every guest arrived decked out in their various costumes, I couldn't help but think I was the hottest one at the party. Laughter echoed as the night progressed, fueled by drinks and an embarrassing amount of candy, until a knock on the door brought me back from my revelry. I tripped over someone's flailing limbs in my dainty heels, but the laughter stopped dead when I flung the door open to reveal a stranger standing under the flickering porch light. He looked about my age, maybe a touch older, with shaggy hair that dripped grease and a face obscured by a mask fashioned from crumpled metal. My heart danced nervously in my chest, and I felt the gasps of friends radiating behind me like echoes from the grave. My costume was not the most conventional attire to greet unexpected visitors, and I couldn't help but feel a spark of embarrassment in my cheeks that battled the adrenaline rush of excitement. I asked him if he was trick-or-treating, half expecting him to rip the mask off and reveal a friend playing a prank. Instead, he tilted his head like a confused puppy and let out a high-pitched giggle. "I'm not here for candy," he said, his voice raspy, scraping the air like nails against a chalkboard, and the chill that crept through me was not from the autumn breeze anymore. I hesitated, unsure why my gut screamed for me to shut the door, but curiosity pulled me further into the strange encounter. "Then what are you here for?" The words left my mouth before I could stop them, and the tension in the air tightened like a noose, his laughter seeping through the cracks of my growing dread. "To celebrate," he replied cryptically, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Before I could process his words, I felt a cold wind gust against the back of my neck, sending a shiver of alarm coursing down my spine. The lights flickered, and for an instant, his mask appeared to flicker as well, shifting beneath the darkness. This wasn't magic or a spell, it was something worse. Then, without waiting for permission, he stepped inside, the air growing thick with a scent I couldn't place, something sweet yet rancid, like molasses gone bad. My friends murmured amongst themselves, unsure how to react, their nervous laughter fading into a palpable concern as he sauntered past us, uninvited chaos draped in tattered joy. I wanted to laugh it off, but as I turned to close the door, instinct kicked in, and I slammed it shut despite his metallic cackle following me into the suffocating atmosphere of the house. The party resumed for a moment, that uncomfortable energy quickly exchanged for lighter banter, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his presence lurking just outside, waiting. Later, around midnight, the doorbell rang again, and despite my resolve to ignore it, something in me propelled me forward, morbid curiosity pulling me like a moth to a flame. This time, no trick-or-treating stranger awaited. Instead, I found a group of children lined up in costumes far too grotesque for the norm. Their faces were painted in a way that made them look like they had crawled straight out of the grave, darkened eyes sunken and hollow and grins stretched too wide, as if pulled by strings from a shadowed puppet master. And right behind them was the man in the metal mask, his laughter cutting through the otherwise silent night like a knife through flesh, wrapping back around my core until I felt paralyzed. "Join us," he called out, beckoning with a skeletal hand, the children behind him chanting some indistinguishable melody that fizzled into rage-filled whispers and laughter. I backed away slowly, feeling the facade of bravery dissolve, hoping that if I didn't acknowledge them, they would simply fade back into the darkness from which they came. But that's when the first child stepped forward, a little girl with tangled hair, whose innocent, hollow gaze locked onto mine as she smiled wide, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. My friends were glued to their spots, their attention trapped by the twisted scene unfolding at the doorstep like an unholy theater of horrors, and I knew I had to put an end to this madness. But when I turned to speak to them, I felt a warmth wash over me, a heat that's dizzying and unnatural, and before I could process it, something drew me back toward the door. the sound of their voices growing louder around me, filling my head with a discordant symphony. I fought against it, pushing against the weight bearing down on me, clenching my fists to shake away the feeling, but then that sinister laughter returned, the metal-masked figure grinning like a Cheshire cat, unwavering, his words slithering through the haze in my mind. "Come out and play." And it was like I was drowning in the darkness with their piercing smiles surrounding me, consuming my senses entirely until the world became nothing more than scattered echoes and disjointed realities. I don't remember how I ended up back in the middle of the living room, the atmosphere suffocating as I stood there, freezing in place. The chaos had descended upon the decor like an unwelcome guest, the lights had gone out, and in that moment, I became aware of the children surrounding me, no longer standing outside, but rather swarming through the doorway, morphing into grotesque shadows bound to drag me down into the depths of their nightmarish domain. Everything crumbled around us, friends dropped drinks in awe that turned to fear, screams drifting weightlessly through the chaos, melting against laughter that rang hollow. In that instant, a voice beckoned me from deep within, a voice demanding me to run, to escape, but I felt paralyzed once more. Every breath I tried to take came out strained, the weight of my costume now a heavy burden as the visage of the man and his twisted entourage took center stage. Again, I thought of my pepper costume, how whimsical it was, a burst of excitement meant to ignite joy, but instead, it had turned into my grave marker, a sign of celebration twisted into humiliation, one that would haunt me long after the crafts of Halloween had faded. It was then I realized how naive I had been, thinking I was the life of the party, unbothered by the lurking shadows of the unknown. I was simply prey, the focus of their dark festivity, and as the sound of my friends' panicked cries dwindled into silence, I understood. The costume was never just a costume, it was my last attempt at protecting what little light remained inside me, before the metal mask and the flickering eyes of darkness faded all that was left of me into the void. Every night at midnight, my golden retriever, Max, would stand at the threshold of the kitchen, his body rigid, tail tucked between his legs, as if an invisible force was pinning him down, and no amount of coaxing could drag him across that line. At first, I brushed it off as an odd quirk. Maybe he was just tired after a long day of being my faithful companion, a never-failing shadow. But as the nights wore on, his fear deepened, transforming something once innocent into a wretched specter of dread. I tried everything, enticing him with treats, his favorite toys, even a gentle nudge, but he'd just whine, drool pooling at his feet, eyes wide with terror, fixated on the shadowy expanse beyond the fridge. It happened more so after I had inherited my late grandmother's house after her funeral, a sprawling Victorian monstrosity that felt more mausoleum than home. I had chalked it up to some old wives' tale, perhaps the house itself held memories too heavy for a dog to bear, but as I lay awake on a restless night, I began to hear the whispering that slithered from the kitchen when the clock struck 12. It started softly, almost like the crackle of a twig outside, luring me with half-formed words, promising revelations just out of reach. My curiosity piqued, I armed myself with nothing but my phone's flashlight and ventured toward Max, who let out a low growl, a warning echoing through the silence that I foolishly dismissed. I stepped into the kitchen, coaxed by the sound now crescendoing, jagged syllables wrapping around my mind like a noose, pulling me deeper inside until I stood before the old-fashioned stove, its iron frame cold and dormant. The whispers grew louder, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as if unseen eyes were penetrating my skin. I turned, expecting to find Max, but he was gone, his absence a sudden void that swallowed the air around me. In a panic, I backtracked to discover the kitchen door swung shut, and the echoes of my fearful breaths resonated off the walls as a hint of bitter frost brushed against my skin. I battered against the door, calling for him, each scream drawing the auditory shadows closer, until I felt him, my loyal friend, clawing at the other side, his whimpers seeping through the wood. "Max. It's okay. I'm right here," I shouted through my desperation, but his cries grew more urgent, tinged with the purest fear that clawed relentlessly at my reason. Frustrated, I pounded on the door once again. Then came that moment, the bone-chilling silence that inevitably precedes the worst kind of revelation. Suddenly, the whispers erupted into cacophonous laughter, melting into a sound that gutted my insides, and I froze, still against the door at his side. With a final shove, the door burst open, and I was thrown back into the moonlit room as I watched Max rush past me, through the eerie flicker of shadows, toward the safety of the living room. I didn't even have the gall to feel relieved as I watched him bury himself beneath the couch, shivering like a leaf in the wind. In that instant, I was filled with dread, a sinking realization settling deep in my gut, Whatever had haunted my dog was still within those eerie confines of the kitchen, tethered just within the shadows. That was when I felt it, a chill creeping over the back of my neck, pricking my skin like a million needles. I dared not look back, but an instinct pulled me, as if it had woven its fingers into my very thoughts, drawing me back to the kitchen as if I were some mindless moth to a monstrous flame. This time, I summoned every ounce of courage and took a single step forward, only to feel something slithering around my ankles, coiling upwards like a serpent poised to strike. I yanked my leg back, my whole body trembling with terror, and that voice, now a hiss, filled the air as I grappled with the notion of running away, yet I was anchored in place. "Come and see," it beckoned sweetly, luring with a tone so duplicitous it tasted like lies. "It's waiting for you." The words rang inside my skull, and before I could stop myself, I was moving again, drawn toward the threshold. The air grew thick and suffocating, and as I stepped into the darkness, I was met with a sight that shattered my entire perception of reality, a mirror, but it was no ordinary mirror. It reflected a kitchen much brighter, almost radiant, yet uncanny, as shadows danced lithely around figures I could barely discern. They twisted and laughed, their faces a kaleidoscope of horror. Then, amid that blurred confusion, I saw him, my grandmother, her features soft and inviting, but her eyes, oh, those eyes bore the burden of dreadful knowledge. "You should join me, dear," she whispered, reaching out through the glass, her fingers grazing something just beyond the dimensional barrier. "Max has always felt it, felt the truth. Why don't you come see?" The moment her lips curled into an unsettling smile, I felt my heart plunge, the weight of her invitation suffocating, and as I scrambled backward, I heard my dog whine pitifully from the safety of the living room, struggling against the urge to protect me from things he couldn't express. The glass rippled as if resonating with my every wavering heartbeat, and as I turned to run, the whispers turned to screams, greedy and bone-chilling as they transformed into something monstrous. A cacophony became a legion of hisses that clawed at my sanity, and I fled, crashing into chairs, smashing frames against the wall, until my vision blurred, and I lost all perception of time in frantic, desperate motions. I found Max beneath the couch, and as I snatched him up, I realized this would never be the same. The shadows from the kitchen had reached out, had claimed a part of me. I shoved through the door, racing to lock it, my heart hammering against my chest as I heard that laughter anew, echoing long after I'd escaped. The whispers were now muffled, a dark promise lingering at the edges of my thoughts. Days blurred into nights, and even as I tried to forget, Max remained glued to my side, his gaze eternally fixed upon the kitchen door, but we both knew the truth. Every stroke past midnight unleashed nightmares, shadows creeping along familiar walls, turning home into something unrecognizable. And though I tried to shut it out, I could still hear that hiss, still felt the yearning pull. It begged me to come home. But for Max, for my sweet dog, I would never set foot near that threshold again. I couldn't bear to see him tremble once more, nor could I trust what lay beyond, lurking just out of sight, waiting for another midnight whisper to call us back into the depths of the kitchen where memories rotted like old food. And each night, just like clockwork, as the hands on the wall ticked ominously toward midnight, we sat in the living room together, praying for morning, hoping that whatever existed in that darkened kitchen would keep its wretched secrets to itself, for one more night.
I never appreciated silence until I found myself in a cabin deep in the woods, isolated from the world for a weekend retreat. I'd always had a busy life, filled with the cacophony of urban noise, blaring horns, buzzing phones, the chatter of strangers. It's what I had grown accustomed to and what I thought I needed. But that weekend, I decided to unplug, to escape. At first, the silence felt unnerving. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. Stepping inside, I was greeted by an unsettling stillness, the creaks of the old wooden frame echoing against the emptiness. I paced the living room, scrutinizing my surroundings, the rough-hewn furniture, the dust motes dancing in the fading light, the air thick with an odd sweetness of pine. A part of me expected the television to flicker to life or the radio to spring into sound, but there was only the quiet, so profound it swallowed my thoughts. I resolved to embrace it, thinking perhaps it would offer clarity. As the hours passed, darkness cloaked the woods outside, and I lit a fire in the stone fireplace, its crackling filling some of the void. I nestled into the worn couch with a book, hoping to drown out my discomfort. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the pages, the silence was suffocating. My mind raced, replaying the stresses of my life, work deadlines, strained friendships, the relentless pressure to succeed. The more I wished for peace, the more my thoughts spiraled, each quiet moment becoming a question of self-worth. With each crack of the firewood, I noticed shadows flicker across the walls, twisted shapes that danced far too quickly to be real, conjuring images of vague fears from the darkest corners of my mind. I told myself it was just my imagination, a product of my unease. I stuffed my annoyance and turned the pages more vigorously, trying desperately to impose some semblance of normalcy. But no amount of distraction could hide the gnawing discomfort of the quiet. As the clock ticked into deep night, the steady rhythm of my breathing became like a countdown. It was as if silence itself was an entity, taking shape around me, watching, breathing. Sleep began to elude me as I imagined what lurked beyond the wooden walls. I moved to the window and pulled aside the heavy curtains, peering into the ink-black wilderness. The moon hung high, skeletal branches reaching toward it, mocking my fear. For an instant, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement. A flash of white darted between the trees, something alive but all too transient. "It's just a deer," I whispered to the stillness, half convincing myself. The night deepened and threatened to swallow the last flickers of my courage. I retreated back to the couch, pulling a blanket tightly around myself, trying to ward off a feeling that had settled like ice within my chest. Just as I was about to drift into a restless sleep, an unmistakable sound broke the silence, a low, guttural whisper, like a breeze rustling through leaves, but sharp and urgent. It sent a chill down my spine. I sat bolt upright, every muscle taut with tension. "Hello?" I called out into the void, my voice trembling against the silence. No response, just the crackle of the fire, the rhythmic pounding of my heart. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell myself it was the wind, or perhaps my overactive imagination, but deep within me something felt undeniably wrong. The whisper returned. Not words, more like a melody, low and haunting, pervasive and feminine. It called out like a siren, luring me deeper into the silence. I felt an inexplicable pull toward the very heart of the forest outside, the darkness as inviting as it was terrifying. My instincts screamed at me to stay inside, yet the urge grew. I had to step into the unknown for one brief moment of clarity. Slipping on my jacket, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the wooden porch creaking underfoot. The air was crisp, slicing at my skin, and the woods felt alive, every rustle and crack echoing impossibly loud in the night. I shone the flashlight into the darkness and saw nothing, only the endless expanse of trees stretching in every direction. Then, I heard it again, the whisper, now clearer. "Come to me." The sound seemed to shift, leading me down an unseen path, the beam of my flashlight flickering in and out until it finally fell on a clearing. In the center was a large stone, worn and ancient, encircled by skeletal trees that looked as if they were bowing toward it. I had never seen anything like it. I approached slowly, my pulse quickening as I immersed myself in the palpable silence, less a barrier now and more a sacred veil. As I reached out to touch the stone, the whispers crescendoed, swirling around me and wrapping my thoughts into a tight embrace. "You are not alone." But in that moment, I felt the overwhelming pressure of lives that had once thrived here, an energy both chilling and exhilarating. I drew back. "What do you want?" I called into the abyss. The wind rustled, carrying the whispers, and I realized that silence was not simply the absence of sound but a voice, an echo of everything that had passed, joys, sorrows, longings, and losses. I stumbled back, more afraid than ever, but also awash with an unexplainable sense of belonging. I fled back to the cabin, shutting the door behind me as if sealing off the spectral whispers. I sat in the dark, contemplating the unearthly communion I had just experienced. The next morning, I awoke with the light seeping through the window, the silence now holding a different kind of weight. I had learned something vital, embraced something that terrified me. Silence wasn't just an empty void to fill, it was a space that invited reflection, vulnerability, and connection to the echoes of those who came before. How many stories had been lost in the noise of daily life? I took a deep breath and let the stillness settle within me. Like an old friend, recognizing that part of true appreciation was listening to the whispers of the past and allowing them to coexist with the present. Instead of squeezing an escape from the silence, I vowed to carry it with me. In the end, I left the cabin and returned to the world, forever changed, having learned to appreciate the hum of stillness woven through my life. I walked now with an awareness that silence was not merely the absence of sound, it was a reminder of everything that needed to be heard.